So my specialty is non-game birds, which is a little bit of what we'll be talking about today. And if we can get my screen to advance, there we go. So the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department's mandate is to conserve the state's fish, wildlife, plants, and their habitats for the people of Vermont. So that's a pretty broad mission. You know, we do the deer and grouse and brook trout, and we also happen to do a few thousand other animals while we're out at it. So we have a few more than 250 different bird species that are regularly seen in the state. Our total list of birds that have ever been seen in the state is more than 300 species at this point. We just got a new one this last winter, which was an unusual one for us. It had blown up from Texas or somewhere. So in addition to all those birds, we have about 60 mammals, about 90 fish, about 40 reptiles and amphibians, more than 2,000 plants, and probably more than 20,000 invertebrates, most of which we don't even have names for. So on the bird side of things, Vermont Fish and Wildlife has a number of ongoing projects, including the restoration of peregrine falcons, which should be in the top left of your screen, nesting on a cliff there. We have restoration projects with bald eagles in the center of your screen. Those are 2 juvenile eagles in a nest. We have golden-winged warblers in the top right. We have common loons in the bottom left that most people will be familiar with. Spruce grouse, which is a rare boreal bird that only occurs in one place in the Northeast Kingdom. And then we have bobolinks, or what some people like to call the R2D2 bird, which are a grassland species. And we have a whole bunch of other projects in addition to these, but these are some of the ones we have ongoing at the moment. And we owe a lot of credit to Audubon, Vermont, as well as the Vermont Center of Eco Studies for conducting a lot of these projects in partnership with us, as well as other partners over time. So this is a really great time for bird watching in the year. Springtime is kind of the season to be a bird watcher. Now, a lot of what we'll talk about today is identifying different species, what you might see, things like that. And if you're into that, there's a Audubon, New Hampshire biologist named Pam that just for fun tried to identify as many species as she could within 5 miles of her house last year. And she got 123 different species in a single day. So they're out there. But I'm going to encourage you, especially if you're new at this, don't worry about trying to identify every single species. Especially maybe you're, not even if you're new at this, maybe you're advanced, but you're just watching in your backyard. Maybe you can identify individuals over time or see some kind of behavior that's really of interest rather than just checking a species off your list. So this is an exciting time in spring because we have migrants arriving. Most of our birds in Vermont are actually migratory. So they'll spend either part of the year in the southern parts of the United States or South and Central America. A few of them actually spend the summers north of us. But more typically, we have, in this case, we're seeing a map of ruby-throated hummingbird. And currently you can see the orange and purples is where they are in the winter, which on that circle diagram is the red portion in the winter. Then in the spring, which is right about now, we get into the blue portion where they're migrating north. They stay with us for the summer in the green, and then they migrate back down south in the fall. So they're actually spending a small portion of the year with us in the summer. And this is what it looks like for ruby-throated hummingbirds. So there they are moving north. They hit us around May. They spend the summer, and then they leave us right around September, October, maybe a little later, depending on where you are in the state. So let's watch that again just because it's fun. So these are real observations of ruby-throated hummingbirds in 1 year cycle. And this is what a lot of our birds look like. Some go even farther south, so you can see they're staying in Mexico and Central America, but some go all the way to the far southern tip of South America even. So when we're thinking about identifying bird species, we've got more than 250 different options, so that can be a little overwhelming. So things we can focus on are the size and shape of the bird, the color pattern, the song, the behavior, and the habitat. And we'll run through each of these quickly. So even if you're new to birding, I bet just based on this silhouette, you could make a decent guess at what some of these are. Maybe you see a duck there, maybe you see a hawk. And in fact, grouping birds into these kind of broad groups of related birds is a great way to do bird watching. You can say, well, I think that one was a sparrow, or I think that one was a duck. And just based on size and shape, you can get a lot of information. Color patterns. These are all warblers. This is a single group of closely related species. But you can notice, even though a lot of them look the same, there are differences. They might have striping that's different. They might have a patch of color that's in a different place on their body. So there's a lot of nuances here, but many of these birds have slightly different patterns, and that's one of the key characteristics we can use. And warblers are probably the hardest group out there. So this is, what I'm showing you right now is tough stuff. Identification. When people get really advanced and are just walking around, probably most of the identification that people do is by the songs or the calls. And there's things like the pitch, so whether it's high and low, the tempo, if it's fast or if it's slow, and the quality. And there's all kinds of entertaining words to try to describe the quality. It might be musical or buzzy or thin or squeaky or lethargic or emphatic. If you read in the guidebooks, they try to translate these into mnemonic devices, ways to remember them, and descriptions, and you can come up with your own over time. So on the left, you can see basically a graph of what a chickadee's song sounds like, the little bee. And on the right, we can see a hermit thrush, which is actually Vermont's state bird. And I'm not going to try to imitate that one, but it's a beautiful flute-like song. But you can see just from the graph, it's much more complex. So you can hear recordings of those available in a lot of places online. Cornell, especially, the Macaulay Library of Sounds has really great recordings for things and is a nice way to learn. And we'll talk about more resources in a little bit. So then another key we can use is behavior. In this case, we have two birds that you might commonly see by your bird feeder. The one on the left is our black-capped chickadee, and the one on the right is a white-breasted nuthatch. So you notice they both have that distinctive kind of triangular black crown on their head. Both have the kind of blue-gray coloration, white breast. They're easy to confuse if you don't know them apart. But one key characteristic that's shown in this photo is a white-breasted nuthatch. We also have red-breasted, actually. So those two species are basically the only species we have that'll climb down a tree with their head facing down. Any other species we have in the state is going to climb up a tree. So if you just see out of the corner of your eye, oh, there's a bird climbing down a tree in the backyard, you can know right away, oh, there's a nuthatch back there. So behavior can be a really good clue, not only for just observing and appreciating the species, but for identifying one if that's what you're trying to do. And then lastly, we have habitat. Birds tend to be habitat specialists. So we have things like osprey, which are feeding on fish. Incidentally, if you ever see an osprey carrying a fish, they're always going to do it that way with the fish facing forward or backwards, but not 90 degrees because there's too much air resistance. They can't fly with a fish that way. So you're going to see an osprey near water because they're eating fish. You're going to see ducks in the water. On the bottom left, we have some shrubland birds. So they like this dense shrubby habitat low to the ground. On the bottom right, we have things like pileated woodpecker and hermit thrush. They're going to be in our northern hardwood forests that make up a lot of Vermont, making use of the trees and different layers of the canopy there. So your habitat can be a really good clue for what species you're seeing. On the top right, we have song sparrow and American goldfinch, which are much more common birds to see in backyards. So what are people seeing right now? I was just pulling up some observations from eBird, which is a site I'll talk about in a minute. And within the last week, a lot of people have been reporting these species, which are resident year-round. So you might see these all winter, all summer, in the fall, anytime. But crow on the top left, and then bald eagle, of course. Then down the center column, we have a northern cardinal, a song sparrow, and a blue jay. On the right, on the top, we have our two very similar looking woodpeckers. We have a hairy, which is the larger, and a downy, which is the smaller. And you can see not only the body size, but the relative size of the bill is a really good clue if you're trying to learn your woodpeckers. Both of them commonly show up at bird feeders in backyards. And then we have our black-capped chickadee, of course. We also have some of these exciting returning migrants that are really just coming. These ones mostly arrived in early to mid-April. We still have probably the majority of our migrants that are still waiting, but we'll be getting more and more every day. So these ones that we've been seeing already are, we have red-winged blackbirds in the top left. Then going down, we have the really funny looking one. That's the American woodcock, also known as timberdoodle. We have a white-throated sparrow in the bottom left. And then the center column, we have a hermit thrush, wood duck, and palm warbler. And most of the warblers wait until May to arrive, but this has been our first arrival. So people have been reporting this warbler already. And warblers are real small. They're not much bigger than a hummingbird, but tend to be very colorful and a very fun spring migrant species. So and then in the right-hand column, we have common loon, osprey, of course, and then tree swallow have also arrived. Now, what are people seeing for behaviors? We have red-winged blackbirds making their really conspicuous display. They make that call that folks remember as being conqueree, and that's what the male's doing in that picture with the red shoulders. Those are called epaulets. The female is next to him there, so that's the more brown bird. In this case, many birds, the males are more highly ornamented. They're more colorful, and the females, it's a little sad to say, but we call them more drab. Now, the adaptive value is they're more camouflaged, so that's a safer way to be. In this case, we tend to see the male birds more because they actually arrive earlier in the spring and they start this very conspicuous display to stake out their territory. They're saying, this is my space and all you other males stay out. And then the female only arrives later, days or weeks later, and then she chooses a male based on the territory and which male she wants. We also have, so that's a territorial display that's happening. We also have the woodcock on the right there, and a little outline in dotted lines there, showing what's called the sky dance. Woodcocks show up in fields this time of year, right around twilight, sunset, both more so in the evening, but also in the morning. And you can hear them make a peep noise, as well as conducting this very intricate display in flight and making some pretty impressive noises. So if you're near some open fields around twilight, listen out for the woodcocks and see if you can see them flying around. So that is a breeding display as opposed to a territorial display that we saw in the red-winged blackbirds. We have turkeys, of course, with another breeding display. We have tom gobblers that are strutting around, puffing themselves up and gobbling. We have eastern bluebirds that are starting to investigate nest boxes if they're box users. I've seen this at my house. I haven't seen any carrying material. You can see the upper one of these two bluebirds is a little lighter colored. That's the female. And she has material in her mouth that she's going to use to make a nest. So this can be a really fun thing to do if you're watching birds. See if one of them has something in their mouth that they're flying with, and you can tell they're collecting in one place and they're bringing it to where they may be building a nest. So keep an eye out for that. Especially around your house, you might see things like robins or phoebes doing this. Phoebes really like doing this on people's houses or on garages, kind of outbuilding structures. So they're going to be starting doing that soon. One bird that's already way ahead on the nesting game is our bald eagles. So if you remember, those are resident birds. They're here all winter, and they tend to start breeding fairly early. They often reuse their fairly large nests up in trees, and most of them have already bred and laid eggs and are now incubating. So they're sitting on their eggs waiting for them to hatch. They should be hatching pretty shortly here. So some resources. The identification books have gotten really good. The ones I recommend the most are the Sibley series, David Allen Sibley. But there's lots of others, some by Audubon, there's a Peterson series, there's a whole bunch out there. I like the ones that are just Eastern North America, because then you don't have to carry around such a big, thick book. It's just a nice little one. If you're just starting out, there are a number of kind of posters, brochures that just list, 10 or 20 of the most common birds you might see in your backyard or at your bird feeder. Those can be really helpful to narrow down the options. Oops, sorry about that. If you're into really crunching data and seeing things online, eBird is great. You can see live observations. I can enter eBird observations on my phone. They'll pop up on your computer and you can see, okay, he was over here. He saw these different species. It was 10 a.m. this morning. It's really powerful. And you can enter your own observations there if you want to. You can just have a list for your backyard going and say, I saw these birds over time, and it'll keep track of everything for you. And then lastly, there are a number of apps on the phone. One by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology called Merlin is a nice one. It's free. That's a nice thing about it. It'll help you identify based on certain characteristics you've seen. The other really nice thing I like is you can pull up a certain bird and play its song. So I'll be out in the field and they'll say, is that the song of a such and such? I can't quite remember, and I can pull up the bird, play the song quietly to myself and verify if I'm on the right track or not. So if we're watching birds around home or maybe in our neighborhood, what are the things we can do to improve the habitat for them or increase our ability to see them? Most of our yards probably don't look much like this one. I think this one's New Mexico. But a few of the things folks have been interested in, bird houses or bird boxes. These can be a really nice way to observe kind of local birds, keep track of what they're up to. It's not something that we consider to be super important as a population measure to assist birds. So it's really more of a kind of personal pleasure thing, but it's certainly helpful for the birds that make use of boxes. Only certain species will use them. So things like bluebirds, there's a screech owl, black-capped chickadees, and house wrens are all pretty common box users. Again, the Cornell Lab of Ornithology has a Nest Watch website where they describe in detail you need certain size boxes with certain size openings. You often need to maintain a predator guard on there, so things like squirrels or raccoons aren't climbing up and into the box all the time. So that's a great place to look for the different requirements there, different habitats where you might put them in. But it is a little bit of work just to maintain, make sure they're all set throughout the seasons. Bird feeding is a big one. So you have on the left, there are kind of seed feeders. So if you're looking for general recommendations, black oil sunflower is usually a pretty reliable one that many species like. Some people use a thistle seed, which is more expensive, but a lot of the finches really like it. We use a particular kind of feeder because the seed's very, very small. And then suet can be a nice addition, which are what the little balls are on the lowest feeder there, which really bring in woodpeckers and some of the other species. So that's a great thing to do throughout the winter. This time of year, we really encourage people to take those feeders down, but we can put up our hummingbird feeders. So this map here is where people have been reporting hummingbirds up until this morning. So all the purple dots are where a hummingbird has been reported. So they're on their way north. If you remember that little interactive map we saw of them flying up from Central America, they're on their way north. They usually arrive here around the first week in May. So it looks like they're right on track. Hopefully we'll be seeing them pretty soon. And hummingbird feeders are filled with a sugar solution. It's about 20% sugar. We do recommend you regularly take it out and clean it, avoid getting ants in it, that kind of thing, but it's just water and sugar. You need to make your own, nice and easy. For those seed feeders, there's a reason we recommend taking them down. So we recommend you only keep them up from December 1st until April 1st. Vermont has a very healthy population of black bears. They're very smart critters, and they are very capable of accessing bird seed almost wherever it is. So we don't want to increase the number of bear conflicts. So we do recommend that everyone takes their seed feeders down on or before April 1st. So habitat. Habitat is really key when we're thinking about attracting birds to our backyards. You can see here, this is a pretty good example. We have a bird feeder there, so they're enjoying that, a way to concentrate birds. We have a water feature in the back left, so birds can take a little bath if they want. But most importantly, we have a variety of vegetation. It's of different heights. So we have some things that are low, some things that are medium, some things that are high. We have relatively little lawn. Lawn doesn't do much for birds. And we have a variety of these different species of vegetation. So all of that diversity is going to enable different birds to find their place within that yard. There's a lot of shelter there, so birds can be on the ground, in the middle, up high. They can really be comfortable in different parts of the yard. The other really important thing when we're thinking about backyard bird habitat is more bugs, more birds. So most of our birds are coming up from parts to the south of us, and they're coming to eat our insects all summer long. So we have a short growing season, but we produce a lot of insects during that period of time, and they've learned that this is where they can come get their bugs. Even the birds that eat fruit, things like cedar waxwings that you'll see just clustered on fruit bushes, they will feed their young insects, particularly caterpillars. So when we're thinking about things that are important food sources for birds, insects, and particularly caterpillars are high on the list. And what we've been finding in recent years is that native plants, the ones that have evolved here in Vermont, tend to host more species of insects than non-native ornamental plants. So things like milkweed and monarchs, right? Insects tend to have a close relationship with their host plants. So in this case, if you want to attract more birds to your yard, one of the things you can think about is increasing the amount of native plants in that space. The National Wildlife Federation has a really great website called Native Plant Finder, where you can just plug in the name or you type in your zip code and it'll give you a whole list. Blueberry is one, for instance. I think it has 250 different species of insects it hosts. So lots of different options. They can be anything from small herbaceous plants to big, tall, shrubby ones and trees. And then there's lots of good places to find these. The Intervale Conservation Nursery grows a lot of local native plants from cuttings. A lot of the local natural resources conservation districts do spring plant sales. So if you're thinking about where to find these, a lot of your local conservation groups have a good hold on them. And many of these are the commonly grown ornamental plants as well. They just happen to be native. So a great way to help birds out there. Now, if we're zooming out a little bit, maybe not our 20 square foot yard, but maybe we've got a little woodlot behind the house. The important thing here is diversity of habitats. So we have layers in the forest going up from leaf litter, small shrubs, mid-story trees, upper canopy trees. We have some live trees and some dead trees. We have some wood that's on the ground. We have a diversity of habitats horizontally across the landscape. So we have areas that are wet, we have areas that are dry, we have some areas that are mature forests, we have some areas that are young forest, still regenerating. So this diversity enables different birds to find their little place in that piece of woods. So when it comes to managing our forest, what we want it to look like is more like the background here. We've got some big trees, some small trees, we've got some stuff that's down. Honestly, good habitat looks messy for most of these species. What we want it to look less like is this fairly manicured, this is actually a southern pine forest there, but you can see how simple that is. It's basically just an understory and then trees all of the same age. So there's a lot less habitat diversity for each species of bird to find their place there. So messy is good when we're talking about forest habitat for birds. There are a lot of good resources for learning more about this. The Department of Fish and Wildlife has our landowner's guide for wildlife habitat for lands in Vermont. That's free and accessible online. It has different chapters on, deer habitat, bear habitat, bird habitat, on ponds and wetlands, all kinds of different things. Vermont Audubon and the Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation partnered on a project called Foresters for the Birds. There's a series of publications there, including this Managing Your Woods with Birds in Mind, that has some interesting things. That's where that last illustration was taken from. And then, of course, Vermont Coverts, which is our presentation today. Thank you, Lisa. So one plug, zooming out a little bit farther, ways you can support bird habitat, not just in your backyard, in your neighborhood. but really in your community, thinking about supporting town and regional planning. We see these blocks of forested habitat as shown here in green. This is an example from Vermont in 1962. Zoom forward to 74, we see a little bit of housing being built. 1980, we see a few more roads, a few more houses. 1996, quite a few more houses. 2007, even more. So this is kind of the pattern of development in Vermont over time, as things are slow, piecemeal, a few things here and there over time. But the end result is that we've lost that nice big chunk of forest, and now we have all these little teeny ones. And those tend to be not as good for most birds that like those big chunks of forest. So supporting town and regional planning efforts to decide where those chunks should be, what your community wants, what's appropriate for you is a really important measure that we can take. And then lastly, supporting habitat throughout the state, various conservation organizations. If you're interested in supporting the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department, we have things like the non-game tax checkoff. We have the license plates you can purchase. And we have a new mechanism called the Vermont Habitat Stamp, which all of that funding goes directly to our habitat conservation measures. So things like buying land or managing land specifically for wildlife. Lots of other good organizations out there, including Coverts, the Nature Conservancy, Vermont Center for Eco Studies, and Audubon Vermont as well. So this is a really exciting time for us to be able to get outside, to explore and observe the birds of Vermont and wildlife. And it's a great way to break up the monotony of being inside that I know we're all experiencing. It's a great thing you can do with your family. And this is kind of the perfect time of year to be doing it. So I hope you're able to get out and enjoy. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have. And that's all I have. Thanks very much.
Great, thanks, Doug. We do have a few questions that popped in. Jock wants to know, in relation to woodcock, how big a field do they need for their breeding displays?
I don't know offhand the exact size, but I think we'd be talking, you know, some of it depends on the landscape. In areas of landscape where there's a large open area, you know, you have dairy farms all around, you've got lots of fields, they might use a field that's 3, 4, 5 acres. If you're out in the middle of the woods, they're probably going to need a bigger field, so something like 10 plus acres. So really, things more like large fields as opposed to mid-sized large lawns.
Okay, great. Sabina's interested in a mixed hardwood forest. What understory shrubs do you recommend introducing once buckthorn has been removed?
Oh, that's a tough one. I'm glad you bring up the invasive species in forested environments. We have some of these that are troublesome. Buckthorn is one, honeysuckle is another, that are really get into the forest understory. Then when a tree naturally falls or you do a timber harvest, they're there to intercept that sunlight. They really grow up. They tend to not be as beneficial for our native bird species. So most often, you know, in a large scale, it's not really efficient to go around planting shrubs and trees. So most often we recommend people do control efforts to remove those species, the non-native ones, as best they can. If they're doing the timber harvest, they wait and see what comes back. And again, they go back in and do control effort if they need to. That's just going to let the native species on site grow up. If you have a smaller area and you do want to do a planting like that, you know, a good clue is just to look around you. So there's tons and tons, many dozens of species of shrubs in Vermont, and some like things that are wetter, some like things that are drier, some like more or less nutrient enrichment. You know, things like dogwoods, serviceberries are really nice kind of flowering examples. In a wetter place, alders are a really good one, but it's really going to depend more on your site. So if you can look around you, see what is growing there and nurture those things, that's the way we tend to encourage people to go.
Great, thanks. Amy would like to know, what's the best time of day to see birds?
Generally early morning or later in the evening, birds are most active. So if you want to just go out into your landscape, into your neighborhood, You know, it tends to be until 8 or 9 in the morning, something like that. You get what's called a dawn chorus right around dawn. So you may have been woken up by this. I know I have, but right around sunrise. And basically the thought is the birds are all announcing, hey, I survived through the night. I'm still here. This is my territory, or come breed with me, or hey guys, whatever it is. So right around dawn, we get a peak in behavior that lasts through kind of later in the morning. But really, any time of day is not bad. I mean, you're just going to see different things. You might see more raptors out hunting over fields, things like that around midday, whereas you'll see more of the songbirds singing, particularly early morning and to some extent later, more like twilight in the evening.
Suri wants to know if you can speak to domestic cats and the damage that they do to birds, and what should we really do with our cats?
Yeah, it's a great question. Scientifically speaking, domestic cats kill more birds every year than any other direct human cause. So that's not including habitat loss. Habitat loss, climate change, those things are always major factors in allowing these species to continue into the future. But we know that domestic cats kill a lot of birds, which is sad. So the absolute best thing we can do is just keep our own cats inside. And, you know, I have a cat that we love dearly. He's 17 and still has the predatory instinct, but he stays inside and does just fine. So that's really the best thing we can do, both for birds and for the well-being of the cats themselves.
All right. Mary out here wants to know crow versus raven. When you don't have a good way to measure size, how do you tell the difference?
Right. Just state it confidently and assume the person with you won't know the difference. No, so crows and ravens, you're right on that. General body size is a great cue. But if you just see one flying in the air, and this happens to me often too, it's hard to get that relative cue. The relative size of the bill is a good cue. So if it looks like kind of a heavy, thick bill versus a smaller, more dainty bill, would be the smaller, more dainty is the crow, the heavier, thicker is the raven. More commonly, I hear them, and it takes a little bit of practice, but the sound is different. The raven, as you might expect, is a bigger bird, and so has a little deeper, more guttural noise, as opposed to the crow being smaller, has a little more higher pitched cawing noise. So you can distinguish them by sound also.
Gabriel, who's 9, watching our program here, wants to know where bluebirds usually make their nest.
That's great, Gabriel. So bluebirds really like open places. So for me, there's a number of big fields, 5 or 10 acre fields right around my house, and they really love those fields. So large open areas. They really love nest boxes. If they don't have nest boxes, they'll use another cavity, a hole in a tree. So they're looking for a protected place inside a tree where they can build their nest. Now, they don't have a big, thick bill like a woodpecker to make that hole. So what they will do, if they don't have a nest box that we put up, is they'll use an old woodpecker nest or an old hole that a woodpecker has carved out for them. And that's where they'll end up nesting. And that's one of the reasons why we recommend people keep those dead trees, standing dead trees or dying trees on their property. It's because those are the softest, the easiest to excavate for woodpeckers and other birds. They create those nest holes that bluebirds and other critters can use.
Well, that answer leads into Acadia's question. Acadia is 6, and she wants to know if birds need a lot of fallen trees in a forest.
Absolutely. So fallen trees are great. There's ruffed grouse that you may know. They make that really deep thump, 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 thump sound. And they use falling trees, the males do, to display on. They walk right up on the top of the tree. They have their little promontory and they make their display to broadcast that sound out through the environment. More generally, those fallen trees are just providing habitat and structure. So birds like the ovenbird nest right on the ground. They're called an ovenbird because their nest is this little contained pocket right in the ground. So anything on the ground that's providing that kind of structure and cover is useful for them. And then the other important reason is those fallen trees promote more insects. That's where you get carpenter ants. That's where you get other bugs growing. and those insects become the food for all our birds.
Great. Erica had a small hawk or falcon dive their finches on the ground last week under the bird feeder. Is this common, and what can we do to deter the predatory birds?
Yeah, so most likely what you're seeing is a sharp-shinned or a Cooper's hawk. They look very similar. One is a little bit bigger than the other, but other than that, they're very kind of nuanced field marks to try to tell one from another. But those are our hawks that'll go after other birds, songbirds, particularly at bird feeders. Songbirds are congregating, so it's a good spot for those sharp-shinned and Coopers to hunt. Unfortunately, I can't say that I know a lot that you can do that would prevent that bird from going after your backyard birds. You know, if you have bird feeders, you can take them down. That would lead to your backyard birds dispersing a little more and the hawk moving on. Most often, they're not going to sit there, you know, all winter and try to hunt birds the whole time. So more often than not, it's just kind of something you see on and off, and it's not a big deal.
Yep, I've always said, you know, when you put a feeder out, you're basically setting the table. You're providing dinner. And if you don't like seeing that, then definitely take your feeder in. And if you look at the calendar, it's after April 1st. Your feeder in Vermont should be taken in at this point in time anyway. So that's the way to stop that behavior. Debbie wants to know about any binocular recommendations.
Yes, binoculars are super helpful for seeing the details on these birds. Generally speaking, what most birders will use is a 8x42 or an 8 power. So there's usually two numbers, like an 8x42 or a 10x42. So the first number, the 8, is the magnification. A 10 would be more magnified, so 8 times rather than 10 times. Most people find 8 is about the right range they want to be in. The second number, the 42, is basically how much light it gathers. It's how big the outer lens is. So somewhere in the ballpark, an 8x42 is usually pretty good for most people. There are some super high-end brands, and you get what you pay for. There's some really nice stuff out there, but most people don't want to drop $2,000 or $3,000 for a pair of binoculars. I know I sure don't. So the super high-end ones tend to be Zeiss, Leica, Swarovski. I personally use a pair of Nikon Monarchs, which I think are a really good deal for the price. They're a few $100s, which is an investment, but they're very high quality. So Nikon makes some good stuff. Vortex is another American company. They make some good optics as well. Most typically, the modern designs are going to be straight barrels, so they just go straight out, rather than the older designs, which kind of go out and then have a jog and then go out again, more kind of L-shaped. So those straight designs are what more people are using these days, and optics have come a long way if you only have an old pair.
Okay. Two questions that sort of relate together. Caitlin wanted to know if migratory birds return to a specific place or a more localized area each year. And Dan wanted to know if phoebes return to their nest and use the same area. So kind of the same question. Will they return to the same area?
That's a great question. So some birds will return within feet of the same area every year. Not all birds. So there's fairly high, what we call site fidelity, whether they come back year to year. We have nesting common terns that only nest on usually 1 or 2 islands in Lake Champlain every year, and they just always come back to the exact same islands, so they're within 10 feet of where they were last year. Most songbirds won't reuse an old nest from the previous year. The thought is maybe it's contaminated with insects, maybe predators found out about it, something like that. So they'll rebuild a new nest every year, but often it is the same bird. So you might have a phoebe that builds a nest on one part of your garage, and then next year it builds it 4 feet over on the same shelf. So there's a fairly high level of return for individual birds.
All right, we have one other question. Someone wanted to know where they can see maps of recent observations of different species. You kind of mentioned that a little bit in the talk, but they'd like a little more clarification.
Sure. So eBird Vermont, or just eBird. Vermont has has kind of its own little website in eBird, but either way will get you there. So it's just the letter E, Bird. It's hosted by Cornell, and they have there's a bunch of different ways to explore it. So you can go in and you can put in, for instance, your county or the state of Vermont, and it'll zoom in there and it'll tell you just as a list all of the birds that have been seen recently. So it might say this morning, Doug Morin went out and he saw American crow and 5 blue jays and something else. So it'll give you the notes on those specific observations. If you search for an individual species, like you want to search ruby-throated hummingbird, it'll pull up a map. And that's where you're going to see everywhere that species has been seen recently. Or you can do what's called a hotspot, and they have little pins on the map. And you can click on that, and you can see all the birds that have been listed from that hotspot. So it might be, if you lived in Burlington, you might click on Delta Park, right at the mouth of the Winooski River there, and say what birds have been seen there recently. It'll give you a list, and you can filter by date. So you might say what birds have been seen there this April. That way I can see the most recent sightings.
Alrighty, we have Erica asking, what's the best way to attract specifically cardinals to her yard?
That's an interesting one. I don't know. You know, cardinals are a common feeder bird, so I would say if you don't have feeders up in the winter, that would be a good one to have. Try a variety of different seeds. They certainly go after black oil sunflower seed. You know, if you have them, not all parts of the state have them. So for instance, I'm in the Northeast Kingdom and it's pretty rare for us to see them. They're a little bit more of a southern bird. So if they are in your neighborhood generally, then you know, okay, I can get them. So bird feeders would be one thing to try in the winter. Otherwise, just trying that variety of kind of cover, having a water source might help. But variety of native vegetation is kind of the best thing we can do.
Great. You mentioned a lot of resources out there for like seeing birds, field guides, or the maps online. What about for learning songs and calls? Do you have something that's your go-to to learn songs and calls?
You know, I don't have much that's recent. I used to use an old set of CDs. I think it was Stokes was the name, Stokes. And I think there's a few of these out there that they lump the songs and calls by what the song sounds like. So for instance, there's a group of birds that you'd say those are the trillers because their song is described as a trill. And so it's things like a swamp sparrow and a warbler and a junco. So they're not actually related birds, but all their songs sound the same. And so you can hear all of those in a row. You can hear the 5 different ones and kind of compare and contrast, which is a nice way to do it if you're really trying to kind of learn everything. But for me, it's most helpful to, okay, I saw that bird right now. Let me take my app on my phone and play the song to myself, either right now or maybe when I go home, and just kind of go over that, because I need the kind of tangible relationship to a bird I've actually seen and trying to get it in my head. The one caution I will say with that is we advise people not to, when you're out in the field, play those songs too loudly, because birds will interpret that as a territorial interaction. So they might say, oh, there's another male over there, and the bird's going to fly right at you and be all upset. And we really don't want to be disturbing birds every time we go out. So just doing it really quietly or with headphones or once you're back home, that's kind of my favorite way to do it.
Great. Well, a couple of people added to the chat box. That's what I love about the chat box. You know, everyone can add their 2 cents, and I think it's great. Mary Ellen notes that Cornell has a course online that you can take on bird song. She's taking it right now, loving it. Cornell offers a number of bird courses that people can take. And Elizabeth notes Birding by Ear CD Field Guide to Eastern Birds. You know, I wonder if they're starting to do something with MP3 or, you know, downloads to your iPhone or whatever. I used to have cassette tapes that I listened to in the car while I was driving to learn my bird calls. So it's still a good way to be doing that. So it looks like things have quieted down in the chat box.
Great.
Oh, someone else added the Audubon Bird ID app is free and really cool too. Thank you so much, Suri.
Yes. Yep.
So if there aren't any other questions, I will note that I put Doug's email and my email into the chat box. You're welcome to email either one of us with any questions that you might have. I encourage you to sign up for the Coverts e-news from our website, www.vtcoverts.org, which was also in the chat box. And sign up for our e-news so you can learn about these and other online programming that we're doing along the line. There's a couple other questions. Erica's son wants to know the best place to hang the birdhouse he made. Ooh, that's an interesting question. It might depend on what kind of birdhouse you made. Doug, I'll let you take a crack at that.
Yeah, so it would depend on the kind of birdhouse. If it's, you know, kind of a smaller, fairly standard birdhouse, the opening is 1 inch or maybe 2, then we'd be thinking it's probably going to be used by something like chickadee or maybe a wren, depending on what kind of habitat is in your yard. And in that case, often people just put them up on a pole somewhere kind of out in the yard, maybe near a little bit of trees. You can even put them out in the woods. Chickadees will use them out there. But it really depends. If you're doing a more bigger box for like a wood duck or an owl, then it's going to want to be in a very particular location. If it's one of the smaller ones, kind of anywhere just a little bit away from the house would probably be fine. You want it to be somewhere they're not going to get disturbed very often. It's a little quiet and out on its own.
Generally, also, you want to face them out of prevailing winds and rains, so it's not blowing into the hole of the box. So depending on where you live, you want to face it in a direction that's going to take it out of the prevailing winds. A final question that I think is really a wonderful one to finish on is, how can they purchase a habitat stamp?
That's great. If you're interested, you can go to the Department of Fish and Wildlife. You can just search Vermont Fish and Wildlife if you like. And it should be somewhere right on the main page. It tends to kind of vary depending on news and what's taking up that real estate on the front page. But there should be a link there about the habitat stamp. It'll take you to its own separate page and an option to purchase it there.
Great, great. Well, that about does it for us today, I think. We answered a little bit on bird calls. So if Dorian asked also how can she identify birds she can't see but she can hear with song, and we talked a little bit about some of the resources out there for that, Dorian. So zoom back in the chat and you can see some of that. It was great fun to have you all on with us today. You're welcome to sign up for our e-news, send any questions that you might have. I'd like to thank Doug and Vermont Fish and Wildlife for being on board with us today. If you'd like to support Habitat, you can certainly purchase a Habitat stamp. You can also donate to Vermont Coverts so we can continue bringing programming like this right to your living room. And we thank you all for being a part of today. Have a great day and get out and do some birding.
Absolutely. Thanks, everyone.